Hello and welcome to Emirates Man. This is the first in a series of talks that we'll be doing with interesting people from within the region. Today, our first talks gives me great pleasure to introduce Ofer Fabian, the president of Rugby Israel, following the historic game that took place last weekend between the United Arab Emirates rugby team and the Israel rugby team. So enjoy. Gives me great pleasure on behalf of Emirates Man and Golf Business and Motivate Media Group to welcome Ofer Fabian, the president of Rugby Israel. Ofer, lovely to meet you, sir.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
A lot of people, obviously with everything that's changed recently, there's a lot of learnings and new learnings. And I think, there was a lot of excitement when there was a realization that actually there's quite a thriving rugby community within Israel. And obviously we're used to the rugby sevens here. It's been running for a number of years. There's a lot of clubs here. So as a rugby person myself, who's played rugby here over 17 years, delighted that there's a new batch of teams and clubs that we can now play rugby with in what is a brotherhood of rugby. Could you maybe give us a bit of insight into the history of rugby within Israel?
Pleasure. So rugby has been around in Israel for nearly 50 years now. The rugby union itself is dating back to the late 1980s. And we've been playing rugby ever since. I've been myself playing for over 30 years now. And just like yourselves, we're delighted to have somebody nearby that we can play with. It's not a big sport in Israel, unfortunately. I would say that the UAE rugby scene is a lot more advanced. We have about 10 clubs spanning from the very north, which is the Upper Galilee, all the way down to Ashkelon and Beersheba in the south. Rugby is being played by all Israelis, which means people of all religions, a lot of Jewish, but also we have Muslims, we have Christians, we have Druze, and we're playing together. In the squad that was traveling to Dubai, there were 3 Druze players who are part of our national team.
Amazing. Now, you came over as a sevens team. Where do you stand in the world of the sevens internationally?
In the sevens, we're playing in Europe, so we are playing in the second tier in Europe. Okay. And so far, we've been out of the 8 teams, we've been ranked between 4 and 5. Okay. We have high hopes to go up to the top tier. We've been beefing up our preparations, our Olympic preparations. From Dubai, many of the players have continued on to South Africa for another training camp and tournament, where they met yet 10 other players. So the team that came to Dubai was composed of some of our key players, as well as some of development players that we're grooming. And we're looking to step up. We have a 5-year plan in place, hoping to get us into the Grand Prix.
Amazing, amazing. And is Olympics a dream? Is there a plan? Is it on the radar?
Yeah, absolutely. We have rebuilt our plan. We had a plan that was implemented over the past 7 or 8 years, and it got us to a certain point. We felt we hit a glass ceiling. And so we did rethinking, back to the drawing board. We brought on board a new technical director, Kevin Musican from South Africa, who emigrated to Israel. And now he's the technical director and head coach for our national teams. And with Kevin, we've revised the plan. It was recently presented to the sports authorities in Israel. And this is currently ongoing. As soon as we finalize it, it needs to be, of course, budgeted, which is another issue, let's say. But as soon as we have that, then we're implementing. In fact, we're already implementing it over the past almost year. With COVID and everything, we managed to have the plan going. So Top players from all the clubs were able to meet 3 times a week in our sports city.
Yeah.
Similar concept to what we saw in Dubai, but we have a sports city. It's called the Wingate Institute. They would meet 3 times a week in the afternoon, practice together, the greater squad in a sense. So that has already started being implemented.
You mentioned budget. Obviously, a lot of the big unions have suffered during COVID recently with budgets, and unfortunately, what we've seen is actually a lot of the 7 squads, both men and women's, have been affected significantly in terms of having funding withdrawn. Has COVID affected rugby and the funding in that way in Israel?
Our situation is somewhat different. Our funding is always, let's call it, relatively minimal. And in fact, the Israeli Rugby Union, finance-wise, was not run in the best way. It was in a relatively large deficit. Our funding throughout the period of COVID, our national funding, grants from the government, have been sustained. And so with reduced activity, that actually helped us in a sense to cover our deficit, and now we are financially stable. So the financing hasn't changed, and financing wise, we're actually doing somewhat better now. However, we were impacted like everybody else. You said affected, but the word now is infected, and with the COVID and the closure, training has not been consistent with lockdowns and everything. Some players were, I don't want to say lost, but fell off the radar. Now we have to try and get them back. A lot of the children, so it's a struggle. It's an uphill struggle to get our numbers back to where they were a year and a half ago.
Minis rugby is massive here. I'm not sure if you've got a chance to experience that and see that. Obviously, COVID restrictions have only got them playing again. But within the minis rugby, we're seeing a massive increase in female participation, which has then led to under 12s, under 15s, under 19s, and growth in the women's game. Have you experienced a similar growth in Israel, or is it sort of further down the line?
I assume you're talking about not the past 12 months, but a bit more than that.
Yeah.
So yes, indeed, we've seen women's rugby pick up in Israel significantly. We had a very nice women's league with 8 teams participating just a year and a half ago. Restarting it now, so they should have their first weekend matches very shortly. In the youth scene, we've invested a lot with the Ministry of Education. Unfortunately, rugby was not allowed to be introduced in schools in Israel until quite recently, and we put a lot of effort into having it approved. Today we have an approved program with the Ministry of Education. We are providing accreditation to physical education teachers. So this is definitely a place where we see a huge growth potential. And at the moment, we can only be envious at what we saw with the UAE. We were speaking to Samir, the development manager, telling us how in the UAE, over 200 schools are playing rugby, which is amazing. Here, it's a fraction of that, but we're looking to turn that and change it.
Having spoken to one of the rugby schools coaches this weekend, and we were talking about the UAE Israel game, I think you'll have no shortage of schools wanting to come over and play your schools. So I think you're about to be inundated with rugby tours from various clubs and schools wanting to come over and experience Israel for the first time. So watch out on that front. Obviously, we talk. Well, absolutely, and everyone's very excited, and particularly the rugby community. Can we just touch on how did the game come about? Who spoke to who? how did it happen? Because this is historic and, you know, and something to be celebrated in the world of rugby.
Yes, it's definitely historic, and we're still pinching ourselves to make sure we weren't dreaming. But actually, and this is something I only learned while at Dubai, this all started back in 2015 in the World Cup in England, where our former president, Menachem Ben Menachem, was sharing a bus ride with his Emirati counterpart, Kaisel Tchalai, and they were chatting, and they said, imagine if one day we can actually have both our countries play each other. That was 6 years ago. It was a dream that nobody ever thought would materialize. And then the Abraham Accords happened. And I was talking to Menachem. I have just replaced him as president. And we said, why not? Let's reach out. And the response was overwhelming. Immediate, yes, of course, let's do it. And it's been a challenge with COVID, but with perseverance on both ends, we managed to pull it off and just came back from an amazing tour, which is echoing, I must say, around the world. You know, we never anticipated such response. We're getting letters from as far away as New Zealand, commending both unions for once again using rugby to bridge two countries and bring two people closer together.
I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, obviously, you know, the Dubai Rugby Sevens now, it's been running for a fair amount of time. We had the 50 years anniversary last year. Will you be joining us for the Dubai Sevens this year? And how many Israeli teams are we looking at coming over? Would it just be men's international? Will there be women's international? Will there be clubs? What's the plan?
So there is no plan yet. It's in the making, as they say. But the main reason for my personal visit to Dubai, other than I really wanted to come, is to discuss exactly what you just touched on. So we're talking now about having a reciprocation tour of the Emirati women's team to Israel very shortly as within 2 months. Still, we need to work out the details and make sure it happens, and COVID and everything, but this is what we would very much like to achieve. We've discussed possible participation in the Dubai Sevens. There, you know, it needs to align with the annual program, and we mentioned earlier budget, so that too would have to be looked at. We have clubs in Israel that I would imagine would be only too happy to go on tour. We've done that previously. We had to fly as far away as Europe to have games, and you guys are just around the corner, so they'll be all too happy to come over and play 15s mostly. We also, of course, play 7s. And then you said youngsters, we have our under 18s, under 16s, where they don't have they don't have a specific tournament that they do for the European qualifications. So for them, an experience in the UAE could again be very meaningful. And the Emirati counterpart of all that I just touched on are more than welcome in Israel, clubs, national teams, seniors, juniors, everyone.
I'm now a senior like yourself in the Vets tournament, and I was looking on your Wikipedia, and I was very interested to hear. And I don't know, they refer to it in your Wikipedia as the Golden Oldies, and they're called the Elders of Zion. How old does one have to be in the Elders of Zion?
Well, the Elders of Zion originally was 80 and up, but we lowered the bar. Yeah, Golden Oldies, they start at 35.
Right, okay. And, so like our vets.
Yeah, it's vets. And yeah, we go on tour every year. And again, now Dubai is certainly on the map as a destination for tour. You asked about further collaboration. So two interesting things that we talked about. And again, the plan is in the making, but a lot of goodwill on both sides. One is to turn this event, this tour, into an annual recurring event, dubbed the Sons of Abraham Tournament, and invite other sons of Abraham. Within the Abraham Accords, we also have normalization now with Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan. We have peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, and they're all more than welcome, and others as well. We'll be happy to play anyone who wants to play us. So looking to extend that into a regional tournament. And the second thing is actually we talked about using this regional tournament to create a combined Sons of Abraham team. So this tournament would be in a sense sort of a selection tournament, creating a team to compete on one of the world stages and as the Sons of Abraham. So a lot of big dreams.
And interesting timing, obviously, with the republishing of the book Sons of Abraham, which has now come to the region for the first time. So lots of positive change there. I just want to get, you mentioned obviously historically you've been playing within the European rugby body. Are we now with the tide of change? And if it's too early to say, please tell me. But will you be joining the Asian Rugby Football Union in line with the rest of the region now that things have changed?
We will be the first to want to do this, and but I'm afraid this is beyond my pay grade. This is world level. We used to be in the Asian Games until 50 years ago, give or take. So as soon as that changes, we will be all too happy to play with our neighbors, rugby, soccer, and all other sports.
It'll certainly keep the travel budget down, I would imagine. So not to mention, yes, you get to play with your neighbors. And I don't know, would you see, I mean, you've had experience now playing, you know, second tier European teams. Is that a tougher route than the Asian? How because obviously you're aware of your neighbors playing and the standards there. How do you view the two?
Yeah, well, rugby wise, certainly the European qualifications, I would say, are among the toughest, maybe second only to Oceania. You know, we've got all the big European names there, and the competition is very tough. Also, physically, the Europeans tend to be quite big, which makes it a little harder for the competition. In other sports, you know, it's different. So it's not like one size fits all. But we are always trying to practice and train at a level which is beyond the level of competition we're about to experience. I mentioned our team is now in South Africa, and they're playing at a level which is quite higher than the expected level of competition come June and July, our qualification ranking tournaments. So wherever we compete, we always try to go above and beyond in that sense.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned traveling abroad, and obviously, you know, it is expensive. I mean, we're very lucky in the UAE and with the Dubai Sevens to have the support of Emirates Airline. What's the state of sponsorship for rugby in Israel?
This is somewhere we have to do a lot of work.
Okay.
The sport is not popular enough to get sponsorships. We do have a couple of sponsorships within the rugby world, so it's not Israel, but it's rugby. So we're sponsored by BLK, which are our
kit provider.
Kit providers, and then we have Rhino as the gear providers.
And well, I mean, will you be making available will you be doing a fans shirt for to commemorate the UAE Israel game?
Absolutely. Actually, we did, and we have over 100 pre-ordered. Now that we're back home and we can handle it properly, then we're going to certainly make it available, and through the BLK website and our website, they'll be available for order and worldwide shipping as well.
You can make that 101.
Yeah, you can actually see I'm wearing one right now. This is the polo shirt. We have both logos. Let me.
Yeah.
We have both logos. We have the national flags, and on the back we have the writing, which is the main thing: peace, salam, and shalom.
Amazing, amazing. Look, we are, everyone within the rugby community here was very excited to hear that the game took place. Obviously, we see that as it's a change for good, and we look forward to welcoming whether it be expat teams, expat clubs also participating, the national team, the ladies teams. And obviously we wish you all the very success in growing rugby more now within the region and playing more games with your neighbours.
Thank you. There's huge excitement here as well. The responses are overwhelming, and the entire Israeli rugby community is saying how this is probably the biggest thing we've done in 50 years of rugby of Israel.
Fantastic. And what's your, just before we finish, what's your Big Sevens tournament in Israel?
Actually, we don't have a Big Sevens tournament in Israel. We have it's off-season sport mostly. Okay. So we have our national team practicing for its test matches, test tournaments. Other than that, we have our end of season is annual gathering of Sevens tournament with a big barbecue. But other than that, we don't have a proper schedule for Sevens games.
I think if you tell everyone the date of when that is, and that you will now be accepting international teams to come over, I think you could be growing that tournament very quickly.
Well, that's a great idea, and I'll take you up on it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you very much, Ofer, and yeah, great speaking to you.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing this story go still further with your help.
Amazing. So that concludes the first of our Emirates Man. Hope you enjoyed it. We certainly did. Big thank you again to Ofer Fabian, the president of Rugby Israel, marking a historic event in the world of rugby where Israel and the United Arab Emirates rugby team played for the first time. Thanks for joining us, and see you soon. Thanks.